Okay, so the first calls are dropping right now. So what's happening right now is if a person just picked up the call, they have to listen to about a 25-second message in order to get on to the event itself. So we're leaving some initial messages, and people are listening to the call at the same time. So we're going to have people in just a second, and when I tell you to go ahead and start. So just give it 1 second. It takes about 30 seconds or so to get the first people on. Okay, Sandy, go ahead.
Good evening, and welcome to tonight's telephone town hall with the Washington Alliance for Gun Responsibility. My name is Reverend Sandy Brown. I'm board chairman of the Center for Gun Responsibility, and I'll be the moderator for tonight's event. We'll begin in just a moment, and I just want to say we're excited to have you join us. A group of experts will be talking about background checks for all gun sales, and we'll give you some important information to help you decide how to vote this year. Before we begin, a few quick points that I want to make. Right now, we're in the process of dialing out to thousands of people, so just stay on the line, and we'll hear from our speakers shortly. And also, we want to hear from you. If you'd like to ask a question, just press 0 on your telephone keypad, and you'll be connected directly to one of our volunteer operators. Again, if you'd like to ask a question, just press 0. And you're going to hear me say the introduction a couple of times so that as other people join us, they'll be able to hear the introduction as well. So again, if you've just joined us, good evening and welcome to tonight's telephone town hall with the Washington Alliance for Gun Responsibility. I'm Reverend Sandy Brown, and I'll be moderator for our event tonight. We're going to begin in just a moment, and before we begin, I just want to say thank you for joining us. And we'll be talking with 2 experts about background checks for all gun sales, and we'll give you important information that will help you decide how to vote this fall. So right now, we're in the process of dialing out to thousands of people, so stay on the line, and we'll hear from our speakers shortly. Again, if you would like to ask a question, just press 0 at any time during this event. Again, press 0, and you will be connected to a way to ask one of our volunteer operators so the question can be forwarded to our experts. So now, without further delay, here with us is Don Pierce. Don is recently retired but has served in law enforcement in Washington State for over 25 years, including as police chief for the city of Bellingham. Don.
Thank you, Sandy. In my capacity as police chief, I've seen tragedies that come when dangerous people, whether they're convicted felons, domestic abusers, or people with severe mental illness, have easy access to guns. I'm talking to you today because I strongly believe that we can do more and we should do more, not only to keep the men and women in law enforcement safe, but also keep our communities safer. And I believe we have a chance to do that this November by voting yes on Initiative 594.
That's great. Thank you, Don. We're so glad to have you here with us this evening. Now, let's make sure to get going on our very first poll question because we'd like to ask you questions as well. For folks on the phone, we'd like to know what you think, and you'll be able to participate using the keypad on your phone. So here is a poll question for you. Do you support background checks on all firearm sales? Press 1 if you support background checks on firearm sales. Press 2 if you're unsure how you feel about background checks on all firearm sales. And press 3 if you do not support background checks on all gun sales. So again, here are the options. 1, if you support background checks on firearm sales. 2, if you're unsure about background checks on firearm sales. And 3, if you do not support background checks on all gun sales. And in a few moments, we'll have the results of this poll, and we'll be able to share them with you. So, great. Thank you for participating. And let's move on to our next speaker, Therese Todd. Therese is with us tonight to offer her perspective on the issue as an experienced domestic violence activist. Therese, would you tell us more about yourself?
Oh, thank you, Sandy. My name is Therese Todd. I'm a survivor of domestic violence and abuse. I work as a paralegal and have lived here in Seattle for over 30 years.
I try to be very active in domestic violence prevention and victim support, and I was a volunteer with the Seattle Police Department's Victim Support Team. I was a volunteer at the New Beginnings Domestic Violence Confidential Shelter and at its free legal clinic. I also helped to found a nonprofit called the Thrivers Action Group that tried to educate our community about the dangers of domestic violence. I currently serve on the Attorney General's Domestic Violence Advisory Group. I hope that we'll have the chance tonight to talk about how important gun violence prevention is to women, to children, and to men who are trapped in violence and abuse. I know that when an abuser has easy access to guns, the fatality risks go sky high, and I'm glad that we're having a discussion about how to prevent convicted domestic violence offenders from getting hold of guns through loopholes.
That's great. Therese, thank you so much for being here with us. And we're just delighted that we can get to our first question now. And our first question is, how do background checks in other states help to reduce crime and save lives? And that's a question for Don.
Well, thank you very much. One of the things that we know is that background checks in other states that have enacted universal background checks have been very effective. We know that police officers are safer. There's fewer police officers in those states killed by firearms, and we find that it does have a very positive impact in keeping firearms out of the hands of people who really shouldn't be armed, and those are felons, the seriously mentally ill, and domestic abusers. So we believe that by looking at other states and seeing the success that we've had with universal background checks there, that we can expect the same kind of positive results here in Washington State.
That's great, Don. Thank you so much for answering that first question. Well, as you know, if you were with us here for the last couple of minutes, we asked you a question. We asked the question whether you support background checks on firearm sales or not. And we have the results of our first poll. The answer is 62% of people on the call support background checks on all firearm sales. 14% are unsure, and 24% say no. So thank you so much for everyone who responded to our first poll. And in a little bit, well, actually, I think we're ready to take the second poll question right now. So the second poll question is, how many sales were blocked in Washington to prohibited purchasers since the National Background Check Law was enacted in 1998? So again, how many sales were blocked in Washington to prohibited purchasers since the National Background Check Law was enacted in 1998? Here are your options. Press 1 for less than 10,000. Press 2 for between 10 and 20,000. Press 3 for between 20 and 30,000. And press 4 for over 30,000. Let me give you the question and the options again. How many sales were blocked in Washington to prohibited purchasers since the National Background Check Law was enacted in 1998? Press 1 for less than 10,000, 2, 10 to 20,000, 3, 20 to 30,000, 4, over 30,000. And we'll give you those results in just a moment. And remember also that by pressing 0, you can give us your question. And so just go ahead and press 0. You'll come up with one of our volunteer operators, and they'll take your question and put you in the queue. We have a live question now, and the live question is from Rick in Port Angeles. Rick, go ahead and tell us your question.
I'm concerned about not only how long it will take to do a background check, but also what about family members or good friends that you want to either will or give a weapon to?
I'm going to ask Don to answer your question, Rick. Thank you so much for asking tonight. Don.
Hi, Rick. I think that's a really good question, and I'll try to answer them in the order that you ask. The National Instant Check background system is very quick. It's usually only a matter of minutes. And one of the things that's been confusing about this issue from some of the opponents is that they're indicating that this is a whole new system, and it's not. We're simply using the same background check system that's currently used for all other firearms transfers. And transfer is language that's used in the firearms law. It's not new to this particular issue, and so the same interpretation of transfer that's used now currently with a federal firearms dealer would be used for these private transfers. The FBI has been very clear that just a casual handing off of a gun to a friend at a firearms range is not a transfer. But if it is a permanent loan or a permanent gift, that would be a transfer. There is exemptions in the law that allow guns to be passed down from generation to generation. So I hope that answers your question, Rick. Thank you very much for asking.
Rick, thank you. And I just want to remind all of our other people on the line that when you press 0, you'll get one of our volunteer operators, and you can ask your question as well. So now we want to go to Tom in Spokane, who has a question. Tom, go ahead and tell us your question.
Yes, Rick. I'm 1,000% behind background checks on firearms, but how do you feel about going farther and keeping weapons out of criminals' hands?
Well, thank you very much, and that's exactly what we think that this measure does, is that we decided years and years ago, and in law enforcement and with support of the gun lobby, that we should do background checks for people who purchase guns through a federal firearm dealer. And that was when the National Instant Check System was set up. And so it was really designed to keep guns away from those folks who are federally prohibited from having a firearm. That's convicted felons, the severely mentally ill, and domestic abusers. And what we're doing with this particular initiative is also including the private transfers in that same mechanism. And we believe that we'll have the same good, effective results from that we've had with the dealers and their sales. So we think that what you suggest is exactly what will happen as a result of the passage of Initiative 594.
Thank you so much for your answer to Tom's question, Don. Now, before we take our next question, I just want to remind everybody again that you can ask your question by pressing 0, and you'll get to one of our volunteer operators who will explain the process. Now, we have the results for our second poll, and it's very interesting. The poll, remember, was how many sales of guns have been blocked in Washington State where prohibited purchasers tried to buy a gun but were not able to because they couldn't pass a background check. And here's what we responded to. Less than 10,000, that was 37% of people on the call tonight. Between 10 and 20,000, 24%. Between 20 and 30,000, 16%. Over 30,000, 23%. Well, that was sort of that was to see how knowledgeable people were about background checks and the effect they've had in Washington State. And there's actually a correct answer to this. And the correct answer is number 4, D. Not only over 30,000 have been blocked, but over 40,000 sales have been blocked to prohibited purchasers since the background check system was put in place. So we're ready for another one of our live questions, and we want to talk to Virginia and hear your question. Virginia from Arlington.
Yes.
Virginia, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Go ahead. Great. Please go ahead and ask your question.
I want to know how you propose to stop gun sales on the Internet when I'm not saying Craigslist, I'm not saying anything else. I'm just saying, how do you propose to stop that in this referendum?
Great. We're going to ask Treese to answer your question. Treese, go ahead.
Well, that's a really, really good question. I'm really thankful that you called in. In Washington State, every year there are over 40,000 guns that are available online without a background check. And nearly 10% of the people that are trying to buy those guns will be prohibited purchasers. And even in the last month alone, law enforcement has twice caught felons who were trying to use the Internet to buy and sell guns. Earlier this year, a young woman named Monique Williams was murdered in Pasco, and her ex-boyfriend was a domestic violence abuser. He was stopped from buying a gun at a licensed dealer, but bought it online and used it to murder her. So the loophole in our law makes it just too easy. 594 will help the system to tighten up on those internet sales. And we are really excited about the fact that this can be done and will be done if we all get out and vote, because voting is what we're really about today.
Great. Virginia, thank you so much for your question. We have another question now from Jim in Seattle. Jim, do you want to share with us your question?
Well, my question is, I understand, and it's kind of on Virginia. I'm switching it to just off of Virginia's question is, what about, I want to sell a gun to somebody, and now that gun goes into the system and it can be tracked, and so now that my ID and everything else with it, my lack of privacy, where does that come into this?
Let's give that question to Dawn. Dawn, go ahead.
Well, the system will work the same way that it currently does when someone purchases a weapon from a federal firearms license. And it's important to understand that 594 in no way, shape, or form creates any registry or does anything that isn't already consistent with state law. So there's no registries created. There's no violation of folks' privacy. And if you're the one selling the gun, I think it's comforting for you to know that the purchaser is not a convicted felon, not a domestic abuser, or not seriously mentally ill. So you'll have that comfort. It's like you wouldn't loan your car to somebody who you knew was a drunk driver, and so we don't think that you should be able to sell your weapon to someone who is prohibited from possessing a firearm. So there's no new inroads on privacy. There's no new registries created. It simply takes what is already a really simple process for purchasing from a gun dealer and applies it to private sales.
Great. Don, thank you so much for that good response. Now, we want to remind everybody that's on the call that you can ask your question also. All you need to do is press 0 on your phone, and you'll be routed to one of our volunteer operators who will tell you the process so that your question can be asked as well. Now, we have Bob from Silverdale on the line. Bob, tell us your question this evening.
My question is, what's the law right now, or what's the process right now for background check, and how would this change with the passing of the initiative?
Okay, Therese, go ahead.
Well, I'm not a real expert on the technicalities, and Dawn is certainly really much more experienced about the technicalities. But as far as I can tell from my review and doing my homework on the initiative, really not much changes. The federal system of background checks has been in place for a long time, and all that 594 is trying to do is to make sure that those same standards, to make sure that weapons are carefully handled and transferred. Those same standards apply to these private sales, these internet sales, these gun shows, quote unquote. All that we're trying to do is to make sure that the very same thing that everyone else is having to go through in order to purchase a weapon is done online and at these gun shows. So to me, I think it's a very common sense approach to making sure that the folks that shouldn't have guns can't get guns.
Good. Dawn, do you have anything to add to Teresa's response?
Well, Teresa was exactly right about how it works, and what it's a national instant check system, and it is virtually instant. And so the beauty of 594 is it takes the system that we're all used to for purchasing firearms and applies it to private sales and online sales and gun shows. And gun shows can actually set up the national instant check system right at the show. There's federal firearms dealers there, and so it can be very seamless. So there is a system in place. It's very simple. The gun lobby has long supported this system. They've supported background checks. All we're doing is closing the loophole so the dangerously mentally ill, felons, and domestic abusers don't have a place to go to illegally purchase a firearm.
Dawn, would you mind going into just a little bit more detail? Let's say that Bob has a gun that he wants to sell to somebody. How does he go about getting that background check for his purchaser?
He simply takes that to a federal firearms licensee, and they have a mechanism set up. They have access to the National Instant Check system, and they run the background check for him, and once the clearance is done, he is then able to sell that weapon with the comfort of knowing that the purchaser is legally allowed to have that gun. And there are over 1,100 federal firearm licensees in the state of Washington. And so you won't have to go very far to find somebody that can do that. And it will, again, provide that comfort of knowing that the firearm you're selling isn't going to end up in dangerous hands.
That's great. Therese, Don, thank you for your answers to Bob's question. I want to remind everybody once again that if you press 0, then your question can be asked and answered as well. Just as you're listening to the conversation, go ahead and dial 0. You'll get one of our volunteer operators who will then show you how to get into the queue. So we have another question from John of Seattle. John, go ahead.
I think they just answered the question on how you go about going through the NICS system when you're trying to sell a firearm to another individual. You say there's 1,100 FFL dealers in the area. Any idea what they're going to be charging to do this?
I think that's a question of Don. And
well, they're going to charge fair market value, and the beautiful thing about our system is with 1,100 of them, the market's going to settle in pretty quick, and it's going to be a reasonable price. And my guess, it's going to be virtually a recovery of their costs. They're going to. My sense is that they're going to want to offer this service because it gets you into their store, it gets you into contact with them, and then they have the ability to maybe sell you some accessory items or some ammunition. And so we think that that it will be very competitive, and it will end up being fair market value. And so we don't think that that's going to be an issue with regard to the implementation.
And Therese would like to help with that answer, too. Therese, go ahead.
One of the things that I think people assume is that I just automatically came out in support of this initiative, and I didn't. I felt like I really needed to do some homework. And when they told me that there were more places to do these background checks than there are post offices, I thought that was a pretty interesting little factoid.
Great. Thank you, Therese. All right. And, John, thank you for your question. I just want to remind people again, if you'd like to ask a question, dial 0 on your phone, and we'll show you then how to get that question forwarded to us, to our experts. So here's a question that was forwarded to me from a caller. The question is, I hear a lot about Initiative 591. What is important to know about that measure? And let's give that to Therese.
Well, I think that is a very important question, and as far as I can tell, 591 wants to simply block 594 from closing the background check loophole. But it's worse than that, because the gun lobby's measure that it will weaken our existing gun laws, and it'll roll back the background checks that we already do at the state level. And these have been part of our background check system for decades. Initiative 591 would make that impossible. These background checks are so critical for law enforcement, and they're critical for us to keep these guns out of the hands of dangerous people.
Okay, Therese, thank you. That's great. I appreciate your response. Well, we have another dial-in question from Lori in Kirkland. Lori, go ahead.
Hi. My first question is, what scenario can you think of that would cause a check on if someone had performed a check before? Like, how would you know if someone actually did? How would you be checking firearms? The second question I had was, are you saying that there's no record being kept of the buyer and seller information that you couldn't turn into a list at some point of who owns and what guns they own?
Well, the first question is the way that you're sure that you're not selling it to a prohibited purchaser is by doing the NICS system. and that will give you the clearance that that person is okay to purchase. So it does, as I said before, give you the assurance. And 594 doesn't change anything as it relates to a registry in the state of Washington. There currently is a electronic file in the Department of Licensing that can be used by law enforcement to help get guns back to their rightful owners. And in my experience in law enforcement, the way that we used it is we would arrest somebody for burglary, or we would find some guns that were abandoned, and we were able to run those serial numbers and get them back to their rightful owner. But it doesn't create a registry in the sense that it's any different than what we already have. It's a law enforcement tool that's currently being used in an appropriate fashion, and the gun lobby and the opponents to 594 have not been able to identify a single case where that law enforcement database was used inappropriately. So the most important takeaway from the question and my answer is that nothing changes as a result of 594. We will continue to operate the same way, and no registry is created.
Great, Don. Thank you so much. Here's another question that has come in, and the question is, are background checks effective in addressing domestic abuse? So that's a question we'll have Therese take a try on. Therese?
Yes, as far as the statistics prove, I think it's something like 38% fewer women have been shot to death by intimate partners in states where these good background checks are being done. So as far as I'm concerned, the notion of domestic abusers owning weapons and having weapons in the home, this is a point where they have a specific target, and that weapon is used not only in a lethal situation when things occur that are beyond imagining, but it's also used as a tool of terror. It's used as part of their threat. It's used not only to threaten the victim themselves, but also to threaten other people that the victim cares about. And so it just has to make common sense that for us to make sure that folks that are predisposed to abuse and traumatize and commit violence against intimate partners, those folks should not have guns.
Excellent, Therese. Thank you. And could you say the statistic again? I think you said it at the very start.
It's 38% fewer women are killed by guns in the states where the background checks loopholes have been closed.
Wow, that's a big number.
It is a big number. And one life saved is what it's about. Just one.
Thank you, Therese. So we have another caller with a question. It's Brad from Longview. Brad, would you like to go ahead with your question?
Hi there. A little nervous, but I'll go.
So am I.
Hello.
It's okay, Brad. Go right ahead.
Yeah, I read through 594, and I found it very confusing to read through. I didn't think it was written very clearly for the layperson to really understand it. Given that I am a healthcare worker, I do have a concealed weapons permit. Out of all my years working in the hospital, fortunately I've never seen a gunshot domestic violent case. However, I do see a lot of physical abuse, and my heart goes out to those people. But my question is, we already have a federal background check when buying a gun. And since I carry, using my concealed weapons permit, I can go in and buy a firearm and take it out of the shop. However, my understanding is a regular person would still have to go through a background check. And I have to go through a background check as well, but I can leave that same day with my firearm.
I think we've got your question, Brad, and I'm going to let Don go ahead and answer it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brad. And it's important to understand that 594 doesn't create a waiting period and doesn't do anything different. You're correct that with a concealed pistol license, you have been through a de facto background check already, and you've been run through the same system that a purchaser would go through. So you're allowed, you're deemed a legitimate purchaser. What 594 does is consistent with current law, and that is that a background check is done, and there's time allowed for local law enforcement and for the background check to come back. If it's not back within a reasonable amount of time, the purchase is already allowed to go forward. So there's no unreasonable delays, and 594 doesn't make any changes to the law in that regard.
Good.
Thanks, Brad.
Don, thank you so much for your answer there. And a reminder to Brad that this would only affect him at the moment at which he's either selling or purchasing a gun, right? It has nothing to do with the gun that he currently owns.
Correct.
Very good. Okay, we have another live question, and that is from Thomas in Olympia. Thomas, go ahead.
Hi. The last question leads into what I want to ask. Don, you've referred several times to an instant check background system, but from working at the Department of Social and Health Services for several years, I understand that you're referring to a criminal background check, where the mental health background check is done by the Department of Social and Health Services, and that isn't instant. So why the reference to an instant check when I think we're all aware that it takes, about 5 days?
Well, because the reason that we talk about the instant check system is because that's the system that's currently used by federal firearms licensees when they sell a weapon. And so nothing changes with regard to that under 594. The same instant check system, which would identify somebody who is an obvious prohibited purchaser, a domestic abuser, or a convicted felon, would be prohibited from making the purchase. Certainly, in my career, I worked long and hard in the legislature to try to figure out ways to get the information about the severely mentally ill available faster. We've been successful in some of those endeavors and not successful in some of those endeavors. And certainly, there's a lot of work to do in this field of making sure that the severely mentally ill don't have access to firearms. But I think what I want to stress is that 594 doesn't make any changes. It takes the current system with all of its warts and applies it to online purchases, to gun shows, and to private sales. And that certainly closes the loophole. And although it's not perfect, we do know that fewer police officers will be killed, there'll be fewer crimes committed, and fewer folks who are mentally ill will end up with guns when they shouldn't. Again, it's not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction, and I believe that it's a step that we have to take. One life makes the check worthwhile.
Thomas, thank you so much for your question. And I just want to remind everybody that when you press 0, then you get directed toward our volunteer operators who will help you understand the process of asking our experts your questions as well. So we were just talking about mentally ill people and guns. And so, Therese, would you talk to us about this process with mentally ill people and why it's important for us to keep guns away from them?
It's such a complicated question, and we know that there are so many things that we need to do to improve our mental health system. And as the person here that kind of ties in together the concept of domestic abuse and mental illness, both of those things are very complicated problems. So there's not any one thing that an initiative is going to do to solve all of those issues. But one thing I know for sure is that 594, by closing whatever loopholes there are out there, that those folks are going to be able to perhaps be prohibited from getting hold of weapons that can too quickly do severe damage. So I just feel like as long as we're on the right track to limiting access to weapons for people that are severely mentally ill or for those who have targets that they have in mind, we're on a better place for society as a whole, and I know Washington State's going to be a lot better when we pass this initiative.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Therese. Now let's go to Pam in Spokane with your question. Pam.
Yes, I want to know if it's already legal for you to loan your gun to a relative or a friend or a neighbor.
Okay, so the question is it already legal to loan your gun to a friend or a neighbor and so on? Don, go ahead.
Well, it is legal now, and it will remain legal under 594. There's an exemption under the law for gifts. And so really nothing will change in that regard if 594 passes. What we're talking about is a true transfer, and under the law, transfer has a specific meaning in firearms law, and 594 references that same type of transfer. And so if it's not a transfer now, if it's done by a federal firearms licensee, it won't be a transfer if it's done by a private individual. So in that regard, the whole issue of what's a transfer doesn't change. But there are exemptions for handing down guns and for loans and for gifts.
Don, that's great. While we're on the topic of transfers, can you tell us what kind of exemptions are there within 594? What things are called out in the law that people should be aware of, that are exceptions that they should know about?
Well, Initiative 594 includes a lot of common sense exemptions, including exemptions for self-defense, for hunting, for sport shooting, gifts to family initiatives. And that's done because Initiative 594 was created to keep the guns out of the hands of dangerous people while also respecting the Second Amendment rights. Gun owners, hunters, and NRA members are all part of the coalition for 594 because they understand that rights like the Second Amendment come with responsibilities. And I can add that I grew up in Eastern Washington. I'm a hunter. I have been a hunter. I own firearms. And I have no problem with making sure that guns are in the hands of legitimate purchasers and that convicted felons, domestic abusers, and the seriously mentally ill don't have easy access to those firearms. It's a responsibility that comes with being a firearms owner, and I think it's clearly a legitimate means of keeping our community safer.
If I could tag on just 1 second, my dad owned guns. I was raised with guns. I was brought up in Tennessee. Everybody had a truck and a gun rack and a gun on the rack. I am very, very strong proponent for the Second Amendment. I want it protected. And my dad, bless him, is up there looking down on me, and he would say, have you done your homework? And I can say, yes, Dad, I did my homework, and I can support this. And he would support it as well.
That's great. Therese, thank you. And Don, thank you as well. Now, I just want to remind you again about your question. If you would like to ask a question, go ahead and press 0 on your telephone dial, and you'll be directed to our volunteer operators who will put you in the queue so that your question can be asked. And we have a question from Mark in Linwood. Mark, go ahead.
Well, actually, I think my question's just been answered, and it was I support 594. However, I hear many of the opponents to it claiming it's a violation of the Second Amendment under the Bill of Rights, but you just finished explaining that, so I'm satisfied.
Well, Mark, I do think that's a very important question, and I can tell you that when I became a police officer back in the early 70s, and every time I got a different job, one of the things that I did was I took an oath. And I took an oath to support the Constitution of the United States and an oath to support the Constitution of the state of Washington. And that includes the Second Amendment. And I can tell you, as a gun owner, as a hunter, a kid who grew up on a farm, and as a law enforcement professional, I would never support anything that infringed on my Second Amendment rights. And so that's why I was very careful about trying to decide what sorts of gun measures I would support. Clearly, 594 has taken that into account. We've taken a system that was supported by the gun lobby years and years ago and simply added it to the loophole so that there wasn't a way for people to get around legitimate checks. And so I feel very strongly that this protects the Second Amendment. As a matter of fact, I think if we can do everything we can to make sure that guns are in the hands of legitimate purchasers, it takes away a lot of the pressure on the Second Amendment. And so I believe that this is a well thought out measure and absolutely protects our Bill of Rights.
Don, thank you. And Mark and Linwood, thank you so much for your question. A reminder, and you probably are tired of me saying this, but if you press 0 on your telephone dial, you can ask your question also. You'll get routed to one of our volunteer operators who will then put you into our question queue. We have a question from Wendy in Federal Way. Wendy, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, my question is, how are they going to decide who's mentally ill, and how are they going to decide who's an abuser? I mean, is that
I think I can take that.
Or?
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. Therese, go ahead.
Thank you, Wendy, for asking that question. I think it's critical, and I'm so glad somebody finally asked. I can answer that question from my perspective as a professional paralegal, because it's important for you to realize that the way that they determine who is severely mentally ill and they determine who is a domestic violence abuser is done individually by court order. So these people have to have a protective order that has been entered against them. They have to have appeared before a judge or court commissioner. They have the right to defend themselves against any allegations or any false things about their mental health status. So all of those things are clearly presented to the court, and court orders are entered. And only when the court order is entered would that information then be available for the background check. So that nebulous, who are they? They are judges, and I think that they have every right in individual cases to make that determination.
And I'd just like to add, Therese, that's exactly right. But it's important to understand that the individuals have full due process rights to be heard and to argue against any determination, whether they're subject to the domestic abuse provisions or the mental health. And it's not permanent. If somebody has that determination and is then prohibited from purchasing a firearm, that's not a lifetime ban. There's the mechanism in the law that allows for that to be overturned, and it does happen. So this isn't a for life kind of a thing. So there's a ton of due process, and it's not just somebody arbitrarily putting somebody's name on a list.
On a list. Thank you.
Great. Wendy, thank you so much for your question.
Thank you, Wendy.
One of the questions we hear so much in the 594 conversation is a question of who's actually supporting Initiative 594. And I've been involved since the very beginning in Washington Alliance for Gun Responsibility and the 594 campaign. And it's great to see the diverse coalition that is involved in this. And so we all celebrated together when the Washington PTSA climbed on board, and then the Washington State Medical Association, and then the Washington Association of Pediatricians. We have over 250 local congregations of almost every different faith imaginable, and 150 of congregations, and over 250 individual faith leaders that have endorsed as well. And it's been great to see as the campaign has unfolded, just the number of editorial boards that have come on board. For instance, the editorial board of the Tacoma News Tribune, the editorial board of the Everett Herald, and the editorial board of the Seattle Times. And so these are all important and influential voices in Washington State that are all lining up in support of Initiative 594. So then another question. Yes, Therese, go ahead.
I have to interrupt because I want to thank you, Sandy, because all of that, I'm sure, had a lot to do with your hard work and your great effort, and we really appreciate that in the community, and thanks to all of those folks who are doing their homework and trying to help us with this effort.
Therese, that's very nice. Thank you. So here's a question that has been forwarded, and I'm going to aim it at Dawn. How is this law working in the state of Colorado right now? What can you tell us about that?
Well, there's a two-part answer to that question. The first part is that legitimate purchasers of firearms have found the system to be seamless and to work very well, and they're able to purchase their firearms without any difficulty. But more importantly is what the law was intended to do, and that was to screen out those individuals who shouldn't have firearms because they're a convicted felon, they're dangerously mentally ill, or they're domestic abusers. And since the Colorado law has gone into effect, 87 private sales have been denied. That's That's 87 handguns or rifles that would have been in the wrong hands had Colorado not enacted the law. And I expect that we'll find the same positive results here in Washington State.
Very good, Don. Thank you so much. Well, we have another question for you. And this is our final poll question for the evening. And the question is, can we count on your support to close the background check loophole in Washington State during this election? And here are your options. Press 1 if the answer is yes, we can count on your support. Press 2 if the answer is no, we cannot count on your support to close the background check loophole. And press 3 if you're unsure and you'd like more information. Let me repeat the poll again. Can we count on your support to close the background check loophole in Washington State in this election? Press 1 if yes. Press 2 if no. Press 3 if you're unsure or would like more information. And before the call is over, we'll give you the results of the poll. Now, this is about the end of our call. And so, Therese, I want to thank you for being here tonight. And maybe you have some words for our callers.
Well, I do, and I really want to thank everyone for participating tonight and participating in this discussion and making this an issue that really is important to everyone in Washington State. As I said, keeping guns out of the hands of people that are dangerous. It's a simple, basic, common sense approach. And I personally have the experience of having faced a gun. And until you have gone through that experience, it's hard to imagine. So from my own personal perspective and knowing so many domestic violence victims who are terrified by that weapon under the pillow next to them, they can't sleep through the night. It may save one life, that's all I care about, but it can do so much more good to make sure that folks who are dangerous don't have guns. And I just want to make sure that everybody gets out to vote, that you don't get confused between 591 and 594. So think about it, vote for 594.
Right,
in case you get confused. And it's a vote in favor of common sense and safety. That's what I believe. So thank you.
Thank you, Therese. And Don, thank you also for being here today.
Well, thank you, Sandy, for the opportunity to participate. For too long, prohibited purchasers, whether they're felons or domestic abusers or the seriously mentally ill, have been able to evade the background check process by purchasing a gun at a gun show or from a private seller online. And this is a dangerous loophole in our law that puts every single one of us at risk, and it especially puts our law enforcement officers at risk. I've spent a lot of time in my career working with law enforcement officers, trying to devise ways to keep them safe so that they go home to their families at the end of the day. We do training. We provide them with equipment. We work all the time on officer safety issues. I believe this is an officer safety issue.
Absolutely.
It's very clear that officers are more likely to be killed by a firearm in states that don't have universal background check than in states that do. And so I'd like everybody to think about this as an officer safety vote, that if you want to help protect your law enforcement officers, help protect your neighbors, vote yes on 594. I really believe it will make a difference. I'm going to vote yes, and I hope you will too.
Don, thank you so much. I so appreciate your being here. And I just want to point out to everybody that's on the call today that Therese and Don and I, actually, all three of us are volunteers.
Absolutely.
We're here tonight because we believe in 594 and we want to make a difference in order to reduce gun violence in Washington State. Now, I want to announce to you the results of our poll, and the result is on the question, can we count on your support to close the background check loophole in Washington State during this election? A clear majority said yes. And so thank you. That's really great to hear. And I just was reading in the newspaper the other day that the support for 594 is ahead by almost 2-1 in Washington State. So it's really great to hear the support that 594 is getting from people all around the state. I want also to say that if you would like to volunteer with the Washington Alliance for Gun Responsibility in order to help us pass Initiative 594, then press 1 now. and you'll be routed again to a volunteer operator who then will take your information and we'll contact you so that you can help us as we work to pass 594 and close the background check loophole. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this call. And sadly, we couldn't get to every single question. We want you to know, though, too, that if you stay on the line, you'll be able to leave a voicemail at the end of this event. And if you don't have a question, we still want to hear from you at the end. And so leave us a message about why you support universal background checks for gun sales. And we can use that on our website, we can use it in social media, or we can use it in other media as well. So just say your name, say where you're from, and tell us why you support universal background checks on gun sales. And so on behalf of the Campaign for Initiative 594, the Washington Alliance for Gun Responsibility, and my colleagues Therese and Dawn, I just want to say thanks so much for being here. Thank you for your time, and have a great evening.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.